Hold him down. Those were the only words he said. Not loud, not a shout. Just 3 words spoken low enough that only the man closest to him could hear them. And half a second later, something in the room cracked like dry wood, and the worst night Lindsay Memorial had ever seen began, very quietly, to end. Nobody in that emergency room had ever heard Marcus Cole raise his voice. Not once, not in 14 months. They would talk about that for years afterward, how the quiet one, the slow one, the man Dr. Vance liked to call the orderly with a nursing license, had ended a hostage situation in the time it takes to boil an egg, and then knelt down in the blood a moment later and started counting chest compressions like none of it had happened at all. But that comes later. Have you ever watched a man get humiliated for being calm? Lindsay Memorial sat on the edge of a town that didn't have a name worth remembering. 3 exits past the interstate gas station, and 2 miles from a county line, nobody patrolled too hard. It was the kind of hospital that took whatever the night brought it: farm accidents, overdoses, the occasional gunshot wound from a hunting trip gone wrong, and it ran on a budget that was always 6 months behind what it needed. The floors squeaked. The vending machine in the break room ate dollar bills and gave nothing back. And on the overnight shift, in the corner of Triage Bay 4, there was a nurse named Marcus Cole who had not said more than 3 sentences in a row to anyone in over a year. Before Lindsay Memorial, his name had meant something, though almost nobody in that building knew it. Staff Sergeant Marcus Cole had spent 9 years as a Special Forces medical sergeant. The kind of soldier other soldiers prayed showed up first when the radio went quiet, and the only sound left was someone screaming for a medic. He had jumped out of helicopters into places that didn't have names on any map issued to civilians. He had run toward gunfire instead of away from it, more times than anyone in his old life would have believed, because that was the job, because somewhere behind every firefight there was a kid bleeding out who needed somebody's hands to be steadier than the moment demanded. He had a silver star folded into a drawer he never opened, and a unit citation he had never once mentioned to a single person at this hospital. He had also, 3 years ago, walked away from the only career he had ever wanted, in silence, without a single word of protest, because the alternative was worse for the men he loved than anything that could happen to him. That part of the story still lived behind his eyes most nights, the way a splinter lives under skin long after the wound has closed over it. A mission had gone wrong in a valley that didn't appear on any briefing slide handed to the press. A call had to be made in under 4 seconds, the kind of call that good men spend the rest of their lives defending to themselves at 3 in the morning. Marcus had made it. He had pulled his team back from a position that command, 2 ranks above him and 4,000 miles away, had insisted was secure. He had been right. The position had been compromised, and the men who would have died holding it walked home instead. But a junior officer with a father who sat on committees that decided careers had died in the retreat, in a separate, unrelated piece of the same chaos, and somebody needed a name attached to a failure that had actually been a success in every way except the one that mattered to a man with influence and a dead son. They gave Marcus a choice: a quiet discharge, his record sealed, his team protected from a circus of hearings that would have ended careers and possibly lives if the wrong details ever reached the wrong ears overseas. Or a fight, a court-martial, headlines, his own name dragged through testimony that would put faces and operational details into newspapers that people in places he could never go back to would read with great interest. He had chosen silence. He had always been a man who chose silence when silence was the only thing standing between people he loved and a worse fate, and he carried that choice the way he carried everything else, without complaint, with his shoulders square and his face arranged into something that asked nothing of anyone. So now he worked nights in a hospital nobody had heard of, 2 states from where he'd grown up, close enough to drive to his mother's apartment every other day after a 12-hour shift, and sit by her bed while the chemotherapy ate away at the woman who had raised him alone on a school cafeteria salary, and never once let him see her cry. Ruth Cole had a stage that doctors didn't say out loud anymore, not because they were hiding it, but because numbers had stopped being the point. The treatments cost more than his salary could carry on its own, so he picked up every overnight shift Lindsay Memorial would give him, traded his off days for cash differentials, and told himself, the way he had told himself 100 times since the Valley, that this, too, was something he could simply absorb without being seen to absorb it. He had made himself a second promise the week he started at Lindsay Memorial, quieter than the first but every bit as binding. No matter what happened on that floor, no matter how loud it got, no matter how badly some panicking second-year resident fumbled a line or some overwhelmed charge nurse lost her grip on a trauma bay, Marcus Cole's hands would stay where civilian hands were supposed to stay. He would not move like a man who had once dropped into hostile territory before breakfast. He would not speak like a man who had given orders that decided who lived. He would be invisible, useful, slow if slow was what they wanted, and absolutely, deliberately forgettable. Because the version of him that moved fast, that spoke once and expected obedience, that version belonged to people who could still be hurt by his exposure. Old teammates with families, a command structure with secrets it would protect by any means available, and a mother in a hospital bed whose insurance depended entirely on him keeping a steady civilian paycheck and a clean civilian record. One slip, even a righteous one, could cost him everything that mattered, so he kept his hands down. That was the plan. Dr. Russell Vance was the problem, though it took Marcus exactly 4 shifts to understand the shape of it. Vance ran the Lindsay Memorial Emergency Department the way certain men run small kingdoms, by making sure everyone beneath him understood, in 100 tiny daily ways, exactly how small they were. He was 41, sharp-jawed, the kind of handsome that photographed well at hospital fundraisers, and he had built his entire identity around being the smartest, fastest, most essential person in any room he walked into. He had been chief resident somewhere prestigious once, somewhere he brought up in conversation roughly twice a shift, and he had landed at Lindsay Memorial under circumstances the rest of the staff only ever discussed in whispers near the supply closet. He liked new hires. He called them fresh meat, with a grin that suggested he thought it was charming. He took their confidence the way other men take lunch money, piece by piece, until there was nothing left to take, and what made him untouchable wasn't his title. It was Denise Holt. Denise was the charge nurse, and she had decided, somewhere in her first year working under Vance, that her own survival depended on being useful to him in ways that had nothing to do with patient care. When Vance needed someone blamed for a missed order, Denise found a name. When Vance wanted credit for a save that wasn't entirely his, Denise rewrote the chart language until it was. They never spoke of an arrangement. They didn't have to. A look here, a schedule favor there. Vance kept the department's complaint numbers low, and Denise kept her position safe. And between the two of them, they had built a small, efficient machine for making sure nobody below them ever rose high enough to threaten either one. So when Vance decided, on Marcus's 4th shift, to make an example out of the new nurse, he expected the usual. A stammer, a flinch, maybe tears if he was lucky, because tears made for good stories later in the doctor's lounge. What he got instead was nothing at all. It happened in Trauma Bay too, over a 63-year-old man with a collapsing airway and a resident named Foley who could not, for the life of him, get the laryngoscope blade seated right. Foley's hands were shaking. The monitor was screaming. Vance was standing at the foot of the bed, arms crossed, watching the kind of slow-motion catastrophe that made for excellent teaching moments in his own mind, and Marcus, who had been quietly restocking suction canisters along the wall, set down what he was holding, walked over without a word, and tilted the patient's head 2 careful inches to open the airway angle Foley had been missing the entire time. The tube went in clean on the next attempt. Vance's face did something complicated, somewhere between embarrassment and fury, both of which he converted instantly into contempt, because contempt was the only emotion he ever let anyone watch him have. "Who told you to touch my patient?" he said, not as a question. The room went quiet enough that the monitor's steady, rescued rhythm sounded loud. Marcus looked at him, said nothing, and went back to the suction canisters. That silence was the thing Vance could not forgive. A scared new hire he could have broken in a week. A silent one unsettled him in a way he didn't have language for. So he did what men like Vance always do when they meet something they cannot immediately categorize. He decided it was weakness, and he set out to prove it. It started small, the way these things always do, in pieces too minor to report and too constant to ignore. Vance rewrote Marcus's schedule to put him on the worst overnight blocks, the ones that bled into double shifts whenever someone called out. He assigned him to restock and discharge paperwork during codes that any competent nurse should have been pulled into, then loudly questioned, in front of the whole staff, why Marcus never seemed to be where the real work was happening. Denise picked up the rhythm without being asked twice. She left his name off the assignment board until 5 minutes before shift change, just often enough to make him look disorganized. She corrected him in front of patients for things he hadn't done wrong, her voice pitched exactly loud enough to carry to the nurses' station. Within 2 weeks, half the department had absorbed the unspoken consensus handed down from the top, that the quiet new guy was probably not quite sharp enough, probably coasting on some community college certificate, probably one bad night away from getting someone killed. Marcus heard all of it. He heard the way conversations dropped half a register when he walked past the break room, the way Foley started calling him Captain Slow with a grin that wanted Marcus to laugh along, the way Vance referred to him, even once directly to a patient's family, as our backup nurse, as though competence were a tier system and Marcus occupied the lowest rung available. He absorbed every piece of it the same way he absorbed everything, without his face changing, without his pulse climbing past resting, because he had learned a long time ago, in places far worse than this one, that the men who survive are rarely the men who react. They are the men who wait. He thought about his mother's voice on the phone, thinner with every call. He thought about the promise, keep the hands down, get through the shift, drive to her bedside, repeat. He did not know, lying awake in his small rented room at 4 in the afternoon, trying to force his body into daytime sleep, that the promise was about to cost him everything he had left to protect. The campaign found its rhythm in the 3rd week, the way these things always do once a man like Vance senses he has found a target that won't push back. He started small humiliations meant to be witnessed. He had Marcus paged overhead during a slow shift to clean up a spill that didn't exist, just to watch him walk the length of the department for nothing, while Denise smirked behind the desk. He assigned him every difficult discharge, every belligerent drunk, every family member who needed someone patient and absorbent to scream at, for 45 minutes about wait times Marcus had no control over. He started leaving notes in Marcus's file, documented concerns about pace, about initiative, about whether the new hire had the temperament for emergency medicine at all, each one carefully worded, each one building a quiet paper trail toward a conclusion Vance had already decided on before he wrote the first word. An old respiratory therapist named Walter Briggs, gray-bearded, half-deaf in one ear from 30 years of monitor alarms, was the only person on that floor who ever looked at Marcus and seemed to see something other than what Vance had taught everyone else to see. He found Marcus alone in the equipment room one slow Tuesday night, restocking ventilator circuits with the same careful, economical movements he brought to everything. "I know hands like yours," Walter said, not looking up from the cart he was organizing. Marcus said nothing, which Walter seemed to take as permission to continue. "I did 2 tours as a corpsman before any of this," he said, gesturing at the fluorescent ceiling, at the whole sterile, beeping world around them. "I know what it looks like when somebody's trained their whole self not to flinch. That stillness you carry, son, that's not nothing. That's discipline. Out where you came from, it probably kept people alive. In here, Vance is going to read it as weakness until the day it isn't, and that day is coming faster than you think." "I'm not here to prove anything," Marcus said, the first full sentence he had spoken to anyone outside of patient care in nearly a month. "I know that too," Walter said. "But son, You don't get to choose when the world stops letting you stay quiet. You can decide not to start something. You don't get to decide whether you finish it. Marcus didn't answer. He went back to the ventilator circuits, and Walter let him, and neither of them knew yet how soon those words would matter. The night it happened started like every other night, with a code at 11 and a drunk driving collision at midnight, and the low hum of the fluorescent lights doing what they always did, burrowing into the space behind Marcus's eyes by hour 10. Vance was on shift, sharper edged than usual after a complaint from administration about department metrics that he had, predictably, decided to take out on the staff. Denise was working the desk, her patience thin, her eyes flicking toward Marcus every few minutes, with the particular hostility of a woman looking for a reason. The reason walked in through the ambulance bay doors at 1:47 in the morning, except it wasn't an ambulance, and it wasn't a patient, not at first. It was 3 men in work jackets, moving fast, moving wrong. The kind of wrong that every person who has ever served in a place where wrong gets people killed learns to recognize half a second before anyone else in the room. The lead man was pressing a balled-up shirt against a gash in his own forearm, blood seeping through his fingers, his eyes wide and darting in a way that had nothing to do with pain and everything to do with what he had just left behind him outside. They were looking for somebody, the lead man said, voice cracking. Somebody who'd run from a job that had gone catastrophically wrong 2 exits down. A robbery turned violent at a cash transport depot, 3 guards down. A getaway vehicle crashed into a guardrail less than a mile from the hospital. He had the bleeding partner with him because the bleeding partner couldn't run anymore, and he had a gun in his waistband because men in his line of work did not walk anywhere unarmed. And behind him, not 30 seconds later, came the 4th man, the one who had pulled the trigger twice already that night, and intended, judging by the look on his face when he shoved through the same doors with a pistol already raised, to make sure nobody in that emergency room lived long enough to describe him to police. The room detonated into the kind of chaos that exists only in places never built to withstand it. Denise screamed. A patient's family member dropped to the floor behind the registration desk. Foley, the resident, froze entirely, his clipboard sliding out of his hand and clattering against the linoleum. Vance, to his credit, tried to assert control the only way he knew how, by raising his voice and stepping forward with his hands up, demanding the man put the weapon down. This is a hospital, you cannot do this here, and the gunman's answer was to swing the pistol toward him and scream for everyone to get on the ground, all of them, now, while his wounded partner sagged against the wall and the 3rd man stood frozen between 2 worlds he had no idea how to navigate. Marcus went to the ground with everyone else. He went down low and controlled, the way every other terrified civilian in that room went down, and from that position, cheek nearly against the cold floor, his heart did not climb past 60 beats a minute. His eyes, hidden by the angle of his head, swept the room the way they had swept 100 rooms before this one, in places where the wrong read of a doorway killed people. He clocked the shooter's stance, weight too far back on his heels, a man who had never trained to fire under pressure and was running purely on adrenaline and fear. He clocked the exits, the supply cart 8 feet to his left, with a tray of surgical instruments still sitting on top from the last trauma. He clocked the wounded man against the wall, blood loss accelerating, eyes starting to glaze, maybe 4 minutes from unconsciousness if nobody did anything, and he clocked, with a cold internal flatness he had not allowed himself to feel in 3 years, the absolute certainty that nobody else in this room had any plan beyond hoping it would be over soon. Keep the hands down, he told himself. Get through this. Get to your mother. But the calculation he had run 1,000 times in his old life ran itself again now, unbidden, the one that had nothing to do with what he wanted and everything to do with what was actually true. The shooter's attention was split between 3 patients on the floor and the desk where Denise was sobbing, his weapon arc swinging in a slow, undisciplined sweep, and there would be exactly 1 window, narrow and brief, where the angle and the distraction lined up enough for someone to close the gap before another shot could be fired with any accuracy. Marcus had found that window in less time than it took most people to register fear. He thought of his mother's voice, thin on the phone. He thought of the promise. And then a woman 2 beds down, an elderly patient too frightened and too slow to fully comply, made a small, panicked sound and tried to sit up, and the gunman's arm swung toward her in a single ugly motion, and Marcus understood, the way he had understood things in valleys far from here, that the promise had just become impossible to keep. He moved. What happened next took 11 seconds, though nobody in that room, replaying it later from 3 different angles of hospital security footage, would ever fully agree on how it had unfolded that fast. Marcus came up off the floor low and economical. No wasted motion, no telegraphed intention, closing the 8 feet to the supply cart in a stride and a half. His hand found the heavy steel base of a Mayo stand without looking, and he drove it forward into the gunman's wrist, a half-second before the weapon's arc could complete its turn toward the old woman, knocking the pistol wide as it fired once into the ceiling tiles in an explosion of plaster and noise. He did not stop moving. His other hand caught the man's collar, used the gunman's own forward momentum exactly the way he had once used larger, more dangerous momentum in places this hospital staff would never be told about, and turned him hard into the wall beside the supply cart. The pistol clattered free across the floor. The gunman's knees buckled. He was unconscious before he finished sliding down the wall, and Marcus had not thrown a single punch to make it happen. The third man, the one who had walked in unarmed and terrified and entirely out of his depth, put his hands up and backed into a corner so fast he knocked over an IV pole. Nobody touched him. Marcus didn't even look at him twice. 11 seconds, start to finish. 1 man disarmed and unconscious without a fractured bone. 1 weapon kicked clear across the floor and out of reach. And Marcus Cole already turning away from the threat entirely, because the threat had never been the point. The point, the only point that had ever mattered to him in any version of his life, was the man bleeding out against the wall 4 feet away. He was on his knees beside the wounded partner before the rest of the room had finished processing what they'd just watched. His hands moved with the same flat, economical certainty they had shown a moment earlier, except now there was nothing controlled violence about them at all, only speed and precision, the particular gentleness of a man who had done this exact thing under far worse conditions more times than he would ever admit out loud. He tore the man's sleeve away, found the wound, a deep laceration that had nicked something it shouldn't have, applied direct pressure with one hand, while his other reached up without looking and pulled a folded triangular bandage from his own back pocket, the kind of bandage no civilian nurse carried as standard kit, the kind a man carries when 14 months of habit have never quite let him stop being ready. "Get me gauze," he said, to nobody and everyone, his voice not loud, not urgent in tone, just absolutely certain, and it was Walter Briggs, of all people, who broke first from the frozen tableau by the desk and ran the gauze over without a single question. By the time hospital security arrived, badges drawn, radios crackling, the scene they found was almost peaceful in its strangeness. 1 man unconscious and zip-tied with a length of IV tubing against the wall. 1 man cowering, hands still raised, in the corner. And a quiet nurse nobody in the building had ever heard raise his voice, kneeling in a spreading patch of blood, holding pressure on a stranger's arm with the calm, unhurried focus of someone who had simply decided, the way he decided everything, that this was the job in front of him, and he was going to do it correctly. He did not stand and take credit. He did not look at Vance, who stood frozen 10 feet away, with his hands still half raised from when he'd tried and failed to talk the gunman down. He did not say a word about what he had just done. He finished the bandage, checked the unconscious man's breathing without being asked, confirmed it was steady, and then simply got up, walked to the sink, and began washing his hands, the way he had washed his hands after 100 worse nights in places nobody in this building would ever know existed. It should have ended there. It was only beginning. Because the hospital's overhead security camera, mounted in the ceiling tile directly above Triage Bay 2, had caught all 11 seconds in crisp digital clarity, and within hours, a clip of it had leaked onto a phone, then a feed, then 100 feeds, the way everything leaks now, hand to hand and screen to screen, until it cannot be put back into the dark where it started. By the next evening, it had a name people were typing into search bars by the thousands. The internet did what the internet always does. It argued, it dissected, it slowed the footage down frame by frame, and pointed at the angle of his wrist, the absence of a single wasted motion, the 11 seconds that ended with him kneeling in someone else's blood instead of standing over a man he could have hurt far worse than he did. Strangers who had never set foot in Lindsay Memorial began asking the same question in comment threads 100,000 deep. Who is he? Why does a hospital nurse move like that? And why, when he could have done so much more, did he do exactly enough and stop? Inside the hospital, none of that mattered yet, because inside the hospital, the story being written by the people with the power to write it was already hardening into something else entirely. By morning, the version circulating through administration carried very little resemblance to what had actually happened. Marcus Cole, the official narrative said, had used excessive and unauthorized force against an armed but cooperating suspect, had assaulted him in a manner inconsistent with hospital de-escalation protocols, and had potentially exposed Lindsay Memorial to significant liability by physically engaging an active threat rather than waiting for trained security personnel. It did not matter that there had been no trained security personnel within 90 seconds of the gunman entering. It did not matter that an elderly woman would very likely be dead if he had waited. Dr. Russell Vance, still smarting from having frozen in front of the entire department while a nurse he had spent a month humiliating, solved in 11 seconds what he himself could not solve at all, wrote the incident report that mattered most, and the version he wrote painted Marcus not as the man who had stopped a massacre, but as a dangerous, unpredictable employee who had revealed, at last, the volatility everyone had apparently suspected was hiding underneath his quiet exterior all along. Denise corroborated every word of it without hesitation. The hospital's risk management department, more frightened of the viral footage than curious about what it actually showed, suspended Marcus Cole that same afternoon, pending investigation, his badge confiscated at the security desk by a man who could not meet his eyes while doing it. He sat in his car in the employee lot afterward for a long time, the engine off, the autumn light flat and gray through the windshield, and he thought about his mother, 2 miles away in a hospital bed of her own, asking the nurses there, every single day, whether her son had called. He thought about the promise he had made and kept for 14 months and broken in 11 seconds, and he could not, even now, find the part of himself that believed he had been wrong. There had been no choice that did not end with someone dying. But the truth had never seemed to matter much inside a building with an incident report, and a man like Vance writing the only version anyone in power was inclined to believe. Outside the walls, the same fight was already splitting the public in half. Someone, within a day, had dug up fragments of his service record, the parts that weren't sealed, and posted them stripped of all context, just enough to suggest a violent past rather than a decorated one. The hospital said nothing to correct any of it, because silence served them. Let him be painted as a loose cannon, and nobody would ask too many uncomfortable questions about why an unarmed nurse had been forced to do the job that armed security should have handled in the first place. It might have ended there, a quiet man erased behind a suspension letter while the internet moved on to its next clip, except the footage reached one more person it was never supposed to reach. Eleanor Vasquez ran a small employment law practice 2 towns over, the kind with second-hand furniture and a coffee maker that had seen better decades, and she had built a career on the particular fury that comes from watching institutions write clean stories about messy truths. She watched the 11 seconds the way she watched everything, twice, the second time with the sound off, and what she saw was not what the headlines were saying. She saw a man who never advanced on anyone who wasn't already a direct threat. She saw a hostage situation ended without a single unnecessary blow. She saw, in the final frame before the clip cut off, a man kneeling in blood to save the life of the very person whose partner he had just disarmed. You did not, in Eleanor Vasquez's long experience, get footage like that from a man who had lost control. You got it from a man trying very hard to do exactly enough, and not 1 ounce more. She drove out to Lindsay Memorial and found Marcus at the small apartment he listed as his address, hollowed out from 3 sleepless nights, and introduced herself in a single sentence. My name is Eleanor Vasquez, and I think they are about to destroy you for the worst possible reason, which is that you embarrassed the wrong people by saving everyone in that room. Marcus studied her for a long moment before he let her in. They have an incident report, he said finally, and a department that has been building a file on me for a month, and a video that already turned me into a headline before anyone bothered to ask why I moved the way I did. You have a video, Eleanor said, that I can read a great deal better than they can. Tell me everything. Start from your first shift. So he did. The reassigned schedule, the documented concerns that arrived weeks before any real incident, the way Vance had needed, for reasons that had nothing to do with patient safety, to find Marcus inadequate before the night ever proved the opposite. Eleanor stopped writing twice during that conversation, and both times she looked up at him with the particular stillness of a lawyer who has just located the loose thread that will unravel an entire false narrative. It is still going to be his word against yours on how dangerous you really are, she said eventually. A panel hears decorated combat medic, and they fill in the rest with whatever they're most afraid of. I need more than 11 seconds. I need the month before it. I need a pattern. There's a camera over the supply room, Marcus said slowly, the kind of detail that hadn't mattered to him until just now. And one in the hallway outside the break room. Vance never knew the hospital installed those last year, after the last lawsuit. Walter mentioned it once, said most of the staff forgot they were even there. Eleanor's expression did not change, but something behind her eyes sharpened considerably. Mr. Cole, she said, when an institution is this confident in a narrative that conveniently ignores 11 seconds of unimpeachable security footage, it is usually because they assume nobody is going to go looking for the 4 weeks of footage on either side of it. She filed the request that same afternoon, a formal demand for every minute of footage covering the weeks leading up to the incident. Every hallway, every supply room, every angle the hospital's risk-averse insurance carrier had quietly insisted on installing after a previous unrelated claim. 3 days later, the response arrived, and Eleanor read it once and went very still in exactly the way she had the first time. Vance had never once mentioned, in his sworn statement, the existence of the secondary camera system, because he had never known it existed, and across 4 weeks of footage from angles he had assumed did not exist. The pattern Marcus had described played out exactly as he'd described it, in silence, in plain digital detail, the schedule manipulation, the manufactured complaints, the small daily humiliations, stacked carefully one on top of another by a man determined to prove a quiet nurse was something less than competent. The review board hearing that followed was not the quiet, contained matter Vance had clearly hoped for. The footage had not stopped circulating online, and a state hospital licensing investigator had flown in specifically because the volume of public attention made it impossible to handle the way these things usually got handled, behind closed doors and away from cameras. Eleanor laid the official narrative out first, in the hospital's own words, so the panel could hear exactly how clean it sounded before she took it apart. Excessive force, unprovoked aggression, a volatile employee whose true nature had finally surfaced. Then she set the camera logs on the table, 4 weeks of quietly documented retaliation that had never once made it into any official report, and watched Vance's composure begin to fracture in real time. She played the 11 seconds again for the room, once at full speed, and then frame by frame, narrating over it the way she had clearly rehearsed a dozen times in her second-hand office the night before. A man with this level of training, she said, generates enough force in a single strike to end a threat permanently. Watch what he chooses to do instead, with an armed assailant actively endangering a room full of patients. She froze the frame on the moment the gunman's wrist twisted away from the elderly woman. No strike to the head, no follow-up once the threat was down. And then she advanced to the final seconds, the most dangerous person in that room immediately on his knees, applying pressure to the wound of the very man whose partner he had just neutralized. That, she told the panel, her voice dropping into something quieter and more devastating than anything that had come before it, is not the record of a man who lost control. That is the most disciplined use of restraint any of you will see on a screen this year, and your own department punished him for it within 24 hours because it was easier than admitting your security protocols failed before he ever had to move. It was a junior security officer, not Walter and not Eleanor, who finally said the thing that ended Vance's career outright. Pulled aside separately by the state investigator, he admitted, voice shaking, that Vance had instructed him, weeks earlier, to file a vague concern about Marcus's temperament, even though he had personally witnessed nothing of the sort, because Vance had said, in so many words, that he wanted something on record before the new hire got too comfortable. The official story did not survive contact with 4 weeks of footage nobody had known to hide. Russell Vance was placed on administrative leave that did not end in reinstatement. Denise Holt's role in shaping the narrative came apart under the same light, and her position followed Vance's out the door not long after. Lindsay Memorial's board, faced with a viral story that had already decided which version of events it believed, reversed Marcus Cole's suspension within the week, expunged the file Vance had spent a month constructing, and quietly began the process of installing the kind of armed security response protocol that should have existed before any of this had ever needed to happen at all. None of it, not the reversal, not the apology issued in language careful enough to avoid admitting fault outright, mattered to Marcus nearly as much as the drive he took the same afternoon his badge was returned to him, straight from the hospital parking lot to his mother's bedside 2 miles away. She had heard fragments of the story from a nurse who recognized his last name on the news, and when he walked into her room, she lifted one thin hand to his face, to the cheek of a son she had raised to be exactly this kind of quiet, and held it there for a long moment before she said anything at all. "I always knew," she said softly, "what you really were under all that silence. I just worried the world wouldn't let you show it without breaking you first." She lived another year after that, longer than anyone had expected, long enough to see her son go back to work at Lindsay Memorial under a new department director who had read the footage and the file and decided, unlike his predecessor, that competence didn't need to announce itself loudly to be real. Long enough to watch him start something on his days off in a converted storage unit 2 blocks from the hospital, a free trauma response course for anyone who wanted it. Veterans struggling to translate years of training into civilian careers, at-risk teenagers nobody else in town had much patience for, nurses fresh out of school who had never been taught what to do in the 11 seconds before help arrives. He didn't put his own name on the sign above the door. He called it Second Watch, because somebody, he said, ought to be standing guard for the people the rest of the world had already stopped watching for. He still worked nights. He still moved through that emergency room with the same quiet, economical calm he always had, restocking carts, holding pressure on wounds, saying very little unless the moment demanded it. But the staff who had once called him slow had learned, in the space of 11 seconds, exactly what that stillness had always been. Not weakness, discipline, the kind of restraint that holds a line for 14 months and only ever breaks when breaking it is the only way left to save someone else. That is the story. But before you go, let me ask you the same question this one started with. Have you ever been underestimated, talked down to, written off by people who decided, based on nothing but your silence, exactly how much you were capable of, and never once bothered to learn the rest. If you have, then you already know what Marcus knew, that the quietest person in the room is very often the one holding the line for everyone else, and that the world only finds out how strong that line is in the 11 seconds it finally breaks. Tell me in the comments, when has someone underestimated you, and what did you do about it? I read every one. If this story reached something in you, share it with someone who is quietly holding their own line right now and doesn't know if anyone has noticed. And if you want more stories about the ones who get overlooked until the moment they absolutely cannot be, stay with us, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Your corner is right here.